right, we are ready for chapter 29, but first let's see where we've been, where we're going. This is our outline of the book of Genesis. We're in the patriarchal history, the second section, and we're looking at the case of Isaac and Jacob. Actually, we're dealing with Jacob now. We've been looking at the family head, the patriarch. It was Abraham, then Isaac, and now we're focusing on Jacob, and we will through chapter 37, and then it becomes Joseph is the focal point. And so that's where we are. We're dealing with Jacob as the patriarch here. Let's review our chapters of where we have been. Chapter 1 of Genesis was 6 days of creation. Very good. Chapter 2, man in the garden. Chapter 3, Adam and Eve sinned. Chapter 4, Cain and Abel. Chapter 5, genealogy from Adam to Noah. Chapters 6 through 9 deal with the flood. So let's talk about what each chapter is about. Chapter 6, reason and preparation for the flood. Chapter 7, flood itself. Chapter 8, coming out of the ark. And then chapter 9, God's covenant and Noah's drunkenness. Chapter 10 and 11 go together as a unit. Think of unit of chapters. That'll help you. Chapters 10 and 11. Chapter 10 deals with the nations that came from Noah's son. Chapter 11, Tower of Babel. Those two chapters give us an explanation where the nations came from. And so we're focusing on the early family, then they expanded to the nations, and then the camera zeroes in on one nation. Out of what man? Abraham. So chapter 12, turning point. Yes, chapter 12, promise and call to Abraham, or Abram, at this juncture. Chapter 13. Yeah, Abram and Lot returned to Canaan. Then chapter 14, war among the kings. That's where Lot was rescued. Chapter 15, a renewal of a promise. So we have Abraham assured of that covenant. Chapter 16, they're going to help God out. So we have Hagar and Ishmael. Chapter 17, major chapter for a Jew. Circumcision, given as a sign of the covenant. Everything from this point on points back to chapter 12 and 17. Chapter 18, visit of two men visit with two announcements, one of which was about what happens in the next chapter. What was it? Chapter 19. Destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Chapter 20 now. Abimelech takes Sarah. Very good. Chapter 21. Birth of Isaac. Shifting gears now. Chapter 22. High point in the life of Abraham. Offering of Isaac. Chapter 23. Death of Sarah and her burial. Chapter 24. Rebekah is found for Isaac. Chapter 25 is end of an era. Abraham dies. We have the death of Abraham and the birth of Jacob and Esau. Chapter 26. Isaac and Abimelech. And not necessarily the same Abimelech, but much like Pharaoh. We talked about that last time. Chapter 27 last time was Jacob is blessed instead of Esau. And chapter 28, Jacob's dream. Now we're ready for chapter 29. Question number 1 for tonight. Chapter 29, a summary. Jacob meets Rachel, yes. And he marries Leah first and then Rachel because he was deceived by Laban. So Jacob marries Leah and Rachel. Chapter 30, same question. Jacob's sons, and what else happens to Jacob? Not only is he multiplying with his children, but very prosperous. Yes, his prosperity. Chapter 31, what does Jacob have to do? He has to flee from Laban. And then 32, he makes preparation to meet Esau, and he wrestles with God. Which is referred to in other places like Hosea. And we'll talk about that here in just a moment. Here is an outline of chapter 29. Let's get into chapter 29 now. The three things happen. I call this simply Jacob marries Leah and Rachel. Jacob meets Rachel at the well, verses 1 to 14. And then we'll talk about 14 to 30. He serves 7 years for each of those, that is Leah and Rachel. And then we have Jacob's sons by Leah that are identified in 31 to 35. Be watching for question number 9, good practical things. We'll come to those in just a moment. Let's get a question or two out of the way. Question number 2, what relation was Rachel to Jacob before they married? Cousins. Because Laban was his mother's brother. Question number 2, which of Jacob's sons were by Leah? All right. All right. Yes. We'll get to those in a moment. Very good. And let's see. Let's get one more. Which of Jacob's sons were by Rachel? Joseph and Benjamin, mentioned in chapter 35. All right. Let's go look at chapter 29. Let's talk about Jacob meets Rachel at a well. Remember, his mother had sent him away and hoped that he would marry someone of the family versus among the Hittites or the Canaanites of the land, and so consequently he has been sent away, and he makes his way toward Haran, comes to this region just before Haran. We'll come to that in just a moment on the map, but let's talk about 1 to 14. As he made his journey, he came to a well. What happens at the well? Place where they watered the sheep, and they waited till there were several there, because there was a large rock at the mouth of the well had to be rolled back, and so they waited till several showed up, and so they're waiting around for that. And so what does Jacob do? Verse 7. Yeah, he saw Rachel coming, and he'd asked about rolling the stone back, and they were waiting for the appropriate time when all show up. And then at verse 8, verse 9, while he was still speaking, Rachel came with her father's sheep, because she was a shepherdess, and came and he saw her, and notice he ran and he kissed her and lifted up his voice and he wept, that he's weeping for joy. He's glad to see her, and we'll see why in just a few moments. But when he begins to converse with her, what takes place? In 11, 12, 13, and 14. Finds out she's a relative. He's already asked, do y'all know Laban? And, oh yeah, we know Laban. In fact, here comes his daughter now. This is Rachel coming here with the sheep, and identifies this is basically saying, here's your cousin coming here. And so he goes and he greets her. And that's why he greets her with great joy, is because she's a relative. And then she sends word back, and he goes back to Laban's house. And so Laban embraces him and is glad that he's there. Now, that's not much to cover in verses 1 to 14, just how they connected and how they met each other. Now, let's talk about 14 to 30, how Jacob serves for 7 years. We're going to learn some things here in this context, a couple of practical things if you don't have anything on question 9. Beginning at verse 15, then Laban said to Jacob, because you're my relative, then I don't want you to serve me for nothing, so what will your wages be? And what was the deal? Yeah, he said, give me your younger daughter Rachel. Now the girls are identified, the sisters are identified in verse 17, that Leah's eyes were delicate, meaning weak. She wasn't as attractive, she wasn't as beautiful as was Rachel, because Rachel was beautiful in form and in appearance. Because of that, there's rivalry between the two of them is going to be seen throughout all these chapters. And that rivalry goes on and on and on. And we'll see, we'll parse some of that out as we go. But at verse 18, he said, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. And verse 19, what is Laban's response? Yeah, better for you to have her than anyone else. Really, I think Laban has in mind that his older daughter is going to marry first, and as evidenced by his deception a little bit later. And we don't know, we're not told here, but it's very possible that he thought perhaps she would marry within that 7 years, that she'll find someone else and she'll marry, and then he'll, or at least be committed to marry someone else. I don't know. But he doesn't seem to have the plan that he's really going to give her, because as it comes down to the point a little bit later, he's going to switch the girls, and that's not going to take place. But verse 20 now, here's a key verse. That he served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed but a few days to him because of the love he had for her. What do you learn from that? Let's get ahead of ourselves. Question number 9. Do you see anything practical in that? Yeah, not only was she attractive to him, and she was very beautiful, the text tells us that, but because he loved her so much that he was willing to serve 7 years that he might have her. But the text says that it seemed but just a few days because he loved her so much. Tells me something of the degree of love you ought to have for the one that you marry. The degree of love that a man ought to have for his wife. The degree of love that you should have for one that you're committed to. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. So the time came then, and what now takes place? At the end of 7 years, Jacob goes to Laban and said, I've worked 7 years. I'm ready for my wife, and we're going to be married. And so the text says that it came to pass that evening that he took Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her, the text says, and now they are married, and he apparently doesn't realize till the next morning. And look at verse 25. Came to pass that he said to Laban, what is it that you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you, and now you have deceived me? What's your first reaction if you're standing to the side listening to that? You got a dose of your own medicine. That's exactly. Jacob is a deceiver. That's how he got the birthright. And he had deceived, and he had been in this business of deceiving, and now he's getting a dose of his own medicine here, and he understands what it's like, and he gets what he deserves. Certainly because he is a deceiver. Those who are deceivers often don't like it when they are deceived. But Laban said it must be done in our country or it must not be done in our country that give the younger before the firstborn, and we just don't do that. And so he never planned to do that all along. So he's here as a deceiver, dealing with a deceptive man, and it's never going to go well when that is the case. Now let's look at verse 30, that Jacob went in, let's back up and we get 27 and 28. In the meantime, he's going to work for 7 years for Rachel now. But the text says at verse 30 that Jacob, after he takes her, his wife, that he went into Rachel, and he loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served with Laban another 7 years. Now, verse 31, God saw that Leah was unloved, or the King James says hated. Here's a Bible definition of the word hate. I don't know where the term hate, it may be, but I don't know where the term hate is ever used in the Bible in the sense of despisal. It may. There is malice. In other terms, it may describe that degree of despisal, but almost always the term hate is used in the sense of a lack of love. Does that make sense? It's used that way in 1 John. It's used that way all through the the epistle of 1 John. And I know it's used right here. The King James renders, God saw that Leah was hated. In the sense that she was loved less. He loved Rachel more than Leah. Didn't mean he didn't love Leah. It means he loved Rachel more than Leah. And God saw that she was hated. For what that may be worth. There's some practical things to make from that in refuting some error sometimes and how the Calvinists use that term, but we'll talk about that another time. All right, anything else down to verse 30? All right, let's finish chapter 29, and then we'll go to some more questions here. Verses 31 to 35, these are the children of Jacob. These are the sons that he has by Leah. And there are 4 that are mentioned here, so let's talk about them. She conceived and bore a son and named him Reuben. And what does Reuben mean? Verse 32, a son. And so each name has a significance, because I've been given a son. And what's her reaction to that? I name him son, and perhaps he will love me because I bore him a son. And so she's wanting his affection to be equal to that. There's that sister rivalry going on here. All right, she conceives again, and this time she says that the Lord heard that I'm unloved, and so now I'll call his name Simeon, and the purpose of that is, he's heard. God heard that I was unloved, or that I was loved less. And so I've been heard, and consequently I had the second son. Here is Simeon. All right, let's get the third son. And she said, now this time my husband will be attached to me, so she named him Levi, which means attached. And then she conceived again, and she said, now I'll praise the Lord, and I'll call his name Judah, which means praise. All right, that's the end of that chapter. Let's get the map of the children. Here is Jacob, and here is Leah, and here is Rachel. And here are the sons that we have seen. Now there's more to come, but we've only got 4 that are mentioned here, and these are the children of Jacob and Leah, and we have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah right now. More is to come later. Now, we'll see all those sons except for one. We're going to get one in chapter 35 a little bit later we won't get to tonight. And who is that? Benjamin. We won't get to Benjamin tonight. All right, anything on chapter 29? Questions, comments, practical things you see? All right. Said he'd worked 7 years, and he did. Jacob was a deceiver. That is true. He got his own dose of his own medicine, but that doesn't mean that he was not a man of his word, and he was in this case. He did. He said he'd worked 7 years, and he did. And he worked another 7 years, and he did. And then he worked 6 more years on top of that. We're going to see in a few moments. Total of 20 years before it was over. Any other questions? Good point. Good point. Things that, what's the old saying, what goes around comes around, and it did here in this case with him. It certainly did. Anything else? Chapter 29. Let's go to chapter 30 now. Chapter 30, we have Jacob's sons and his prosperity. And we have basically 2 things happen here. These are sons that are born to Bilhah and Zilpah, by Leah. These are the handmaids that have been given. We'll say more about them as we get through that text. And then Jacob and Laban agree for Jacob to take some of the flock, and he prospers, the text tells us in chapter 30. All right. Let's get question number 5 here. What agreement or agreements had Laban made with Jacob? Okay, very good. Yes, at least 3 agreements that are mentioned in these, at least these 2 chapters, with the one wife, with the one daughter, and then with the other daughter being a wife. And now here's the agreement with the reference to he could have all the speckled and spotted sheep, and the brown lambs and the speckled goats, and his wages, and he could go. And that was the agreement that he had. All right, let's go through chapter 30 now, verses 1 to 24, and talk about the sons that are born to Jacob by Bilhah and the other handmaid that is mentioned here. So let's talk about those verses. Beginning at verse 1, we see this sister rivalry again, that when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister and said to Jacob, give me children or else I die. Now here's the one that was the favored one. That's interesting. And the one that was loved more is now feeling like she's being despised because she has no children. And so Jacob is upset about that and asks, is he in the place of God? So she proposes that Bilhah be the one that has a relationship with Jacob. And so now we see the children that are conceived by Bilhah. Let's see who those are. We have 2 that are mentioned here before we get to Zilpah. And the first one's name was, verse 6, Dan. And the meaning of that is judge. Because she said that God has judged my case. And because God has judged my case, I'll name him Dan. And that means judge. Well, then she conceived again. And his name was Naphtali, and that means wrestling, the wrestling of God, or my wrestling. And so I'll call him Naphtali, meaning wrestling, because great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister. There's that rivalry again, and I have prevailed. So there was this wrestling, and I prevailed, and so I'll name him wrestling, or God wrestled. And so those are the two sons. Now, by Bilhah. Now there is Zilpah, who was Leah's handmaid, and she bore Jacob a son, and the first son was named Gad, and the second was named Asher. What does Gad mean? Found in verse 11. Troop or fortune. It said a troop comes, and so she called him a troop. And Asher in verse 13 means happy, because she said, I am happy, for the daughters will call me blessed. And we'll stop there for just a moment. We'll come back to Leah. Now, we've got 8 children, I think, so far. That's the 8th child. So let's go back to our map just for a moment before we finish that. It's not what I meant to do. Let's find our children here. And so we have Bilhah, and we have Dan and Naphtali, and now we have Gad, and we have Asher by the 2 handmaids. Now what happens beginning at verse 14? Yeah, Jacob, Reuben, rather, goes out and gets mandrakes. And what happens because of that? Yeah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. Well, let's talk about mandrakes and what's the value of the mandrakes. Or you tell me, what are the mandrakes? Yeah, it was thought to produce fertility. This is a quote from Brown, Driver, and Briggs, one of the most recognized and reputable lexicons of the Old Testament. It says the word mandrake refers, in Genesis 30:14, as a plant that would excite sexual drive and favor procreation. And ISBE and several other sources make the same reference. But Brown, Driver, and Briggs is one of the more reputable lexicons. And so that was the thought behind that basically it was like taking a fertility plant or fertility drug, and so that's what she's thinking. So I want those mandrakes because I want to have children by Jacob. And so the deal was worked out that you can have lie with him tonight if you'll give me the mandrakes. And so Jacob came in from the field, and Leah went out to meet him and says, I've hired you for the mandrakes. So now we have more children to be born. We have child number 9, 10, and 11 by the time we get to verse 24. And by Leah, now we have another child whose name is Issachar. We have Issachar right here as one of the children of Leah. And Issachar means what? All right, yes, it means hire, because she had hired Jacob by giving the mandrakes. Then she had another son, and his name was Zebulun. She said, I've borne 6 sons, and I'll call his name Zebulun. And what does Zebulun mean? My husband will dwell with me, means to dwell. And so she has Zebulun. Then there is a daughter that's mentioned here. And not that daughters are not important, but it was the sons that carried on the family name, and that was the 12 sons. We're going to be talking about the 12 tribes being of the 12 sons of Jacob, but her name was Dinah. So here are the children by Leah, and that is we have Reuben, and we have Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Dinah. Those are the children by Leah. And it is through Judah The little cross there on the map shows you, or on the diagram shows, that is the lineage through which the Messiah is going to come. So it's going to come through Jacob and then Judah, and it's through that tribe that indeed the Messiah is going to come. Now we have one more child to be mentioned here by Rachel. God remembered Rachel and listened to her and opened her womb, and she conceived. And she said, God has taken away my approach. So she called his name Joseph, which literally means he will add. The Lord shall add to me another son. And so now we have all of the sons there except for one. And we don't get to that to chapter 35. And that's here, that's Benjamin right here. That we'll talk about by Rachel. So Rachel had Joseph and Benjamin, but Benjamin is not mentioned tonight, but all the other sons are mentioned. So we've got 11. If you've numbered those in the margin of your text, Joseph should be number 11 to keeping up with the sons. Starting back with Reuben in chapter 29 and in verse 32, start numbering those and you've got 11 by the time you get to Joseph. Number 12 is to come a little bit later. All right? Now let's start at verse 25. Let's go back to our outline and talk about, any questions on the first 24 verses here? All right, let's talk about Jacob and Laban agree and the agreement that they make. And it came to pass that after she had born Joseph, what's Jacob's idea? I want to go back to my country. I want to go back home. Give me my wives and the children for whom I have served, and let me go. And Jacob said this, or Laban said this. This is interesting. There's something practical here. Something he knows. Yeah, I have prospered because of you. But he said, here's how I know that. Had God revealed that to him? How does he know that? I know it by experience. Experience teaches you a lot. Having gone around the block a few times teaches you a lot. There's a lot to be learned by experience, as well as some kind of reading and learning by information being poured into us. We learn by experience. He said, I've learned by experience. I just know by experience. It's because of you that the Lord has blessed me richly. And so, he said, name your wages and I'll give it to you. So what's the deal that they made? Verse 32. All right. So he said, he made the deal with him. Here's what Jacob said. Let me pass through the flock today and let me remove all the speckled and spotted sheep and all the brown among the lambs and the speckled among the goats, and that'll be my wages. I'll take every one of them. Sound like a pretty good deal from Laban's standpoint, because the text implies that that wouldn't be the larger portion. So what does Jacob do now? Seems a little strange in our day, but this was a common thought of the day. True or not, it was a common thought. Verse 37. Make them striped and make them speckled. The idea was that what sheep focus upon during their, or when they're mating, that will put a mark upon their offspring. And you say, well, that doesn't happen, or that's not true. That's not the point. That was the common thought. At least several scholars suggest that was the common thought, that what they focus upon when mating, that is a mark is put upon the offspring. However, this seems to be a case more of divine intervention. And you say, how do you know that? Let's jump ahead to chapter 31 in verse 9. That God has taken away the livestock from your father. This is Jacob saying that this was the work in the hand of God. So there seems to be divine intervention. Was this Jacob trying to influence divine intervention, or was he going with some of the common thought that whatever they focused upon, and if they're looking upon something spotted when they mate, then the offspring will be spotted? I don't know. But nonetheless, that was his plan, and that's what he did. So the flocks conceived, and they brought forth streaked and speckled and spotted. In other words, the deal that he had made, most of them turned out to be just like what Jacob had said that he would take. And so when we get down to verses 41, 42, and 43, the man, particularly verse 43, 42 and 43, that when the flocks were feeble, he did not put them in. So the feebler ones were Laban's, and the stronger were Jacob's, and he became exceedingly prosperous. So he just grew and grew and grew in his prosperity. So that's the point of chapter 30, that Jacob is growing in his prosperity, and it was the hand of God. We don't want to see that to chapter 31. Any questions or comments now, or practical things you learn from chapter 30? Observations you want to make from chapter 30. Yeah, there's all kind of conflicts, but here was the spirit, and you're right about that. There was conflicts because of man having one wife and then another wife, and then there's two handmaids. Basically, he's got two wives and two concubines is basically what he's got. And there's going to be conflicts because of it. There's rivalry there. But there was this sister rivalry from the very start. All right, anything else before we go to chapter 32 now? Or 31, I'm sorry. Absolutely. That's a good point. Good contrast. Yeah, Jacob has always wanted the best and the most for himself. He's more like Lot than he would be Abraham in that regard. Anything else? Chapter 30. Let's go to 31. Chapter 31, Jacob flees from Laban. Let's see what happens here. Three things happen in chapter 31. We have Jacob flees from Laban, verses 1 to 21. Laban pursues Jacob, and then Laban makes a covenant with Jacob in the rest of the chapter. So let's see what happens here in chapter 31. Let's take the first 21 verses. Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons. In other words, they begin to talk. Sons saying, brother-in-laws. Yeah, stealing from his father. Now, this was a deal. He may be a deceiver, but that was a fair deal, was it not? That whatever the flocks produce, if they're speckled and they're brown and if they're streaked, then I'll get those and the others you can keep. And it just so happens it was an intervention of God we're going to see here in chapter 31 and verse 9. But yet they said he's stolen. One practical thing, don't believe every charge you hear. Just because someone makes a charge doesn't mean it's true. Nonetheless, that's another story within itself. And Jacob saw the countenance of Laban was not favorable toward him. In other words, he begins to see the resentment building in Laban. And so the Lord told Jacob to do what? Verse 3. Go return to your land. Return to the land of your father and to your kindred, and I will be with you. This is what you need to do. I want you to go back, and that was the direction of God. Now remember that, because we're going to come to something else before we get through this chapter here in a minute that seems to be contradictory to that. But now verse 4, Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field, to his flock, and he said, I've seen your father's countenance, and it's not favorable toward me. And as you know, with all the might I've served him, and yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God will not allow him to hurt me. And he talks about the deal that he made. We'll come back to the deal in a moment. Willis makes an observation at this juncture that it is not a violation of leadership for a man to consult or inform his wife of what's going on. I thought that's an interesting point. Here Jacob is obviously a patriarch, which not only is he the head of these wives, have authority over these wives, he's the family head of all the children that come after that until he's gone. He's kind of the family head. But the fact that he's the family head and has leadership does not mean that he can't consult his wife, or his wives in this case, and inform them. There are husbands who sometimes think that I'm the boss, I make the decisions, and I'm going to inform my wife of all the decisions that are being made, and I'm not going to consult her about anything. That's rather foolish within itself. But anyway, that would almost preach if we had an opportunity, wouldn't it? Now look at verse 8. He explains to Rachel and Leah that here's what your father has done to me. He's deceived, changed my wages 10 times, and we made a deal, and now verse 9, God has taken away the livestock of your father and has given them to me. Which tells me this seemed to be divine intervention. Jacob recognized this as divine intervention. So whatever the deal was of putting the stuff before the livestock as they're mating, whether that actually works or doesn't work, this was divine intervention. God made it work, and so that this was God favoring him. And God had promised him he was going to protect him. What else does Jacob say now? Verse 9 and 10, he explains basically what happened to the livestock. And he said, an angel spoke to me. Look at verse 11 and verse 12. And he said, lift up your eyes and see all the rams that leap upon the flocks are streaked. This is while they're mating, that they're gray, speckled and gray spotted. And I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. This was God's hand, again, divine intervention in this. And I'm the God of Bethel, and I've anointed your pillar, where you anointed the pillar, where you made a vow, arise, get out of the land, and return to your kindred. So he tells them, basically, God's told us to go back and we're going to leave. Now then, what happens? What's their reaction to that? Yeah. They think about their inheritance, but what do they say about their inheritance? Yeah. He's done spent it all. And so to stick around here with him, we're not going to gain any inheritance by sticking around. And are we not considered basically strangers? He's sold us and has completely consumed our money. And so for all the riches that God has taken, has given to you. But basically, look at verse 16. Underline it. You might underline at the end of verse 16. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do it. They seem to be women of faith. Jacob may have been a deceiver. Abraham may have lied, but these were people of faith. And consequently, verse 16 says that they said, if that's what God told you to do, then that's what you do. Whatever God's told you, do it. That'd make a good sermon, wouldn't it? Whatever God has said to you, do it. And so Jacob rose and set out on the camels and took off. Now, where's Laban at the time? He's off shearing sheep. Doesn't know they're leaving. And so in the meantime, what does Rachel do? Yeah, notice verse 19. While Laban was gone, Rachel had stolen the household idols of her father. But Jacob didn't know that, and she takes them off. What was that she took? Well, I don't know exactly what they look like. Here is a teraphim, which is what that was. These are some teraphims found in some museums that have been discovered through archaeology. May have been very similar to that. Here's seemingly the thought process, though we don't know for sure, that it was thought that the gods implied leadership. And the one who had these gods, had possessions of these gods, was in leadership. And it may have been her trying to protect Jacob's right to the father's property. Because he's beginning to brood and be upset about that. And if he's in possessions of these idols, or these gods, or these household teraphims, that makes him kind of the household leader, and he may come and try to take these away, the possessions away from Jacob. And it may be her way of, if he tries to take them away, I've got the leadership. I don't know. That may be the case. Some have suggested it may be trying to keep him from following them, of using these gods, thinking that's some kind of directive to keep from following them. But there's some value, she thought, in taking these gods with her, or these idols, these teraphim with her. Not sure what she was thinking. Now, where did Jacob and his wives head? To the mountains of Gilead, right in this region right here. So they're coming from up in the north up here, and they're making their way down to this region of Gilead. Now, that's going to be on down in here where some events are about to take place. But that's the region in the mountains of Gilead. All right, let's go back to our text. That gets us down to about verse 20. Where are we now? About verse 21. Now, start at verse 22. Laban now, verses 22 to 42, pursues after Jacob. And what happens now? He took out after them, and God said something to him. What did God say? Yeah, be careful that you speak to Jacob neither good nor bad. And he turns around and he tells Jacob later when he gets in touch with him, this is what God told me, that I'm not to treat you either good or bad. What does that mean? He had some reverence for God himself and some respect for God, and God's communicating with him. It seems to be don't threaten his life or somehow entice him to return. God's intent is for him to go back to the land of Canaan. Remember, God gave him that instruction. And so God's protecting that. So don't say anything to him good or bad. I assume, and there is an assumption here, so take it as an assumption, that there was more to that conversation God had with him than is what's recorded right here. But I don't know that. But don't say anything to him good or bad. That is, the bad would be threaten his life apparently, and good may be to entice him to come back. I'll bless you, I'll give you more. I'll give you more possessions if you come back and bring my daughters back to my land. God's wanting him to go to the land of Canaan. That's where he's wanting to go. So now what happens? Beginning of verse 25. Yeah, he come up and Laban caught up with them, and he said to Jacob, you've stolen away unawares, and why did you flee and steal away from me? And notice verse 28. I said we was going to come to this. And you did not allow me to kiss my sons and my daughters. Now you have done foolishly in doing so. Actually, Jacob is doing what God told him to do, isn't he? And yet Laban says, what you've done is you're doing foolishly. Here's something very practical. If you don't have something on question number 9. Quite often when you do what God says, somebody else will say you're doing foolish. You ever done what God says and people act and say you're foolish for acting so? Maybe you take a stand for truth and you say this is truth versus error, and I cannot fellowship this error. You're acting foolish over that. Or I'm going to have to withdraw fellowship from someone because of their sin. You're acting foolish over that. I cannot forgive you until you repent. Well, you're acting foolish over that. Or I'm going to forgive because God commanded me to. You're acting foolish in doing so. Quite often doing what God says, you'll be accused of being foolish. But let's get on through the rest of the chapter. Laban accuses him of something. Look at verse 30. You stole my gods. You've acted foolish in running off and you stole my gods. And Jacob doesn't know that. So what does basically Jacob say? Yeah, whoever stole your gods will be killed. Not knowing it was Rachel. And so Laban goes and he searches. And he goes into Leah's tent and they're not there. And he goes everywhere in everybody else's tent. But he comes to Rachel's tent. And she says she can't rise. She says, because the manner of women is with me. That is, she's on her monthly cycle. And that's what she claims anyway. And so she says, I cannot rise and I can't do that. So consequently, she basically begs him not to search. And he doesn't. Now notice at verse 38 tells us how long he'd been serving. 20 years I've served you. And he basically reminds him, I've never done anything wrong. I have never stolen from you. I've never done anything. Look at verse 41. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years, and you've changed my wages 10 times. Now verse 42 has an interesting phrase. Unless the God of my father and the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac had been in me, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. In other words, if God had not been dealing with this, then I would have been sent away empty-handed. But notice that expression, the fear of Isaac. And by the way, that's used again at verse 53. He said, by the fear of his father Isaac. That's an interesting phrase. We'll deal with that a little more another time.